From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Thursday, August 24th. You might have forgotten we're still in the midst of winter. It was 24 degrees and sunny in Sydney earlier this week. In Melbourne, the forecast for tomorrow is 20 degrees. While experiencing this midwinter warmth may come as a pleasant surprise, it signals a troubling future for humans, say climate experts.
The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived. The air is unbreathable, the heat is unbearable, and the level of fossil fuel profits and climate inaction is unacceptable.
We are living through some of the hottest times on record. In fact, this past July was the hottest month recorded ever. Today, National Environment and Climate Editor Nick O'Malley on the dangers these high temperatures pose and why it may just be the beginning. So Nick, even though we're in the middle of winter here in Australia, heat is something we're all hearing about a lot right now. And that's obviously because of the record-breaking temperatures we're seeing around the world, as well as the terrifying fires and the heat waves. So can you paint a bit of a picture of what exactly has been going on across the world over the last few months?
Well, terrifying is probably the right word. Most recently, people in this country, I suppose, would have been reading about the fires on the island of Maui.
Good evening from here in Maui, where we have just learned that this is now the deadliest wildfire in modern U.S. history.
115 people are now confirmed dead. 850 people are missing, and this is because fires on this typically hot, wet, moist island ripped through because the island is getting a lot drier, partly due to climate change.
In the distance, that was a lush green hill, now scorched to its core. It shows the power of these wildfires.
In Canada, there's 1,000 active fires.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is sending in armed forces to help with the evacuations and fight the fast-spreading flames.
I think twice as much land has burnt this fire season in Canada than in any other in history.
It's the worst wildfire season in Canada's history. At least 1,000 fires still burning across the country.
There are still heat domes progressing slowly across the United States. We've seen the same thing across the Northern Hemisphere. We've seen it in Siberia. We've seen these slow-moving, intense heat waves moving across Europe, across parts of the Middle East, across parts of North Asia.
The unprecedented heat waves continue to ravage Asia this year. The latest heat wave here to hit the continent set temperature records in multiple countries, including India, Pakistan, Vietnam, Thailand and Singapore, as well as some cities across China.
In a remote township in China, I think they recorded a temperature of 52.5 degrees.
As countries scramble to address more frequent heat waves, it is likely that the climate crisis is supercharging heat waves in Asia.
But the southern region hasn't been spared. There is a chunk of sea ice missing in the Southern Ocean about the size of Western Australia. Normally you would see ice in the south expand and contract, imagine over the seasons, imagine a lung breathing. This year in winter the sea ice just didn't come back. And that's going to have profound consequences that we don't yet fully understand. So we're seeing intense heat even in cooler areas around the world. But it's not just the fact that it's hot, it's the fact that records are falling not by small amounts, but by a % or two in some cases. And scientists have never really seen that before. It's just unexpected.
And this July has been deemed the hottest summer ever on record. So can you put that in perspective for us? How far back are we talking? And just how much hotter are the temperatures that we're experiencing right now in comparison to the past?
It's estimated that the world is now, on average, between 1.2 and 1.5 degrees hotter than it has been in many tens of thousands of years. When people talk about this July being the hottest on record, they often refer to 120,000 years. And they're saying that because, we can track a lot of this. We look at just records from modern equipment that take us back to the mid-1800s, say. And then we can look at a whole range of other tools such as ice cores, ocean sediments. These are tree rings. These are proxy data which give scientists readings back to about 20,000 years ago. And then we enter the last ice age, and we know that the Earth was cooler. Paleoclimatology tells us that before that, the Earth was cooler to, 120,000 years. But it's the speed at the warming in the past few years that is really horrifying people. It took the world after the last ice age tens of thousands of years for the average global temperature to warm by about 3 degrees. We've seen this 1.2 degrees warming to 1.5 degrees warming in the past few decades.
I mean, that is sobering, to say the least. So, Nick, I wanted to talk about the reasons why we're seeing temperatures like we haven't seen in tens of thousands of years. So can you explain to us why heat has become such a problem?
Basically, greenhouse gases reflect heat back towards the surface of the Earth. Therefore, that's why it's nicknamed the greenhouse effect. What's happened with the extreme heat temperatures across the northern hemisphere in the past couple of months is one of the outcomes of that. And what we've seen is as the Arctic temperatures start to warm, it slows down a jet stream, the jet stream which typically moves weather around the northern hemisphere. Now, it slows that down because those are high altitude winds that normally move quite rapidly. And they're caused by the differential between the temperatures in the Arctic and lower latitudes. Now, as the differential has slowed, the winds slow. And as those winds slow, heat domes, what we used to call heat waves, start slowing down as well. So you have these high pressure systems which would normally move more rapidly across land masses in particular, because heat is worse over land masses. Less is absorbed by the ocean or reflected back into space. As they slow down, it gives time and space for heat to accumulate, and the pressure increases, and under high pressure, the heat is exacerbated even further. And they're moving more slowly, and as heat moves slowly, it has a more profound effect on the environment, on the people and the animals and plants living underneath it.
Which is what I wanted to get to, because I'm hoping you can tell us a bit about the human toll of all of this, because my understanding is that heat waves are the most lethal of all extreme weather events. And what's just happened in Hawaii is obviously a devastating illustration of that.
Yeah, heat is an interesting one. On the whole, you could say in normal circumstances, extreme cold kills people, or cold weather kills people. People die, and old people in particular die in unheated homes across the northern hemisphere when they don't have access to energy, for example. But of the extreme examples of weather, it is heat that kills the most. And it's because it's inescapable. You can mostly, not entirely, but you can mostly escape a flood. You can mostly escape a fire. Not everyone does. But you can't escape heat. It settles over a really wide area, and it settles for days and days or even weeks. And in that, people who are older, people who are ill, or sometimes just people who are outside working, they are exposed to temperatures which are not safe for human bodies, and they start to die. And one of the really horrifying things that we've seen in many places, it's been noted in Iran, it's been noted in parts of China in the past few weeks, noticed in parts of the United States, is temperatures that are so high that they're lethal to normal, healthy adults over a period of time. We're getting to what's called the wet bulb temperature, and this is, or the heat index. This is a measure where you combine both the heat and the humidity. And it reaches a level where the human body, which normally cools itself with perspiration, no longer works. If it's humid and if it's a particular temperature, you can sweat, but the sweat doesn't then evaporate and dry off, which is the cooling process. And if that doesn't happen, the human body can't cool itself, and people begin to die if they're stuck outside without shelter or access to something like air conditioning. Another thing that happens is, you can judge, we can count how many people have died, for example, in that horrendous tragedy in Maui. It takes a long time to gather all of the population-wide statistics on excess deaths, but also on hospital admissions and so on, to find out how many people die in extreme heat. But over the past few years, those numbers have been coming in, and 60,000 is a measure from last year. The huge heat wave from a decade or so ago in France killed almost that many as well. So this is the future that we're looking at the moment.
And so we're also hearing things like we have a choice between collective action and collective suicide. That was something that the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in a speech earlier this week. And a former UN climate chief just recently said that we need to cut emissions or we will, quote, all scorch and fry. So are we seeing any response to this? Are any governments around the world turning around and saying, okay, now we have to act?
Well, look, just to go back to that language, to be clear, there is a live debate about whether or not Antonio Guterres' language is perhaps exaggerating the intensity of this crisis. There are those who say, well, no, we're not quite at that position and perhaps we should be speaking more clearly. There are others, scientists who I speak with, who say, no, he's bang on. This is the language that the moment we're in demands. So I think that's worth noting. The second thing I'd say is that, well, no, we're not acting. There is huge action being taken in the world to address climate change at the moment. Since the Paris Agreement in 2015, the amount of renewables deployed has startled even some of the optimists. The amount of finance that is being directed towards that is startling. But my observation is that if we accept the readings that we're seeing, we're still treating this as an orderly transition to decarbonising the world. And there's some evidence here that we're seeing that perhaps the time for orderly transition is past. Perhaps we should be accelerating far faster. The problem that we face is that politicians face is that our political systems and our economies are not really geared up for such radical decisions or for pumping so much money into one sector of the economy or extracting so many resources to dedicate towards one thing. We saw as recently as Sunday the Resolve Political Monitor, which is conducted for the Herald and the Age. It found that just 12% of voters nominated the environment and climate as their top priority. That's on par with health and aged care. And understandably, nearly 50% of people said keeping up with the cost of living was their main concern. And this is the sort of thing that's replicated around the world. People respond to their most pressing issue at any given time.
So in other words, like Taylor Swift might say, we're the problem, it's us.
Well, we're not pushing politicians to do what is needed to be done.
And you mentioned just a bit ago the Paris Agreement of 2015. In that, the world agreed to pursue efforts to limit the world's average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So is that number totally out of reach now? And if so, what does that mean?
There's a live debate on that. There's good evidence that we bumped over 1.5 degrees this year, far, far earlier than people had predicted. But having average temperatures graze over 1.5 for a short period does not necessarily mean that that target is gone. Under the terms of the Paris Agreement, under the terms of that international treaty, to break 1.5 suggested that average temperatures had to remain above that for a long time. And scientists that I speak with keep on reminding me, it is possible, if you drastically reduce emissions, that we go above 1.5 for a period of years, stabilise, and then slowly pull back over the rest of the century. I think it's now likely that we'll tick over above 1.5. There's a lot of good evidence that we can still stabilise and pull back before 2 degrees. Each hundredth of a degree, I'm constantly reminded, will have a profound impact on all of our lives. So there is still a lot we can do. And to be clear, there's a lot of bad news here, but it's not all bad. The amount of carbon dioxide we're pumping into the atmosphere is still growing, but the rate of its growth has massively reduced because of the Paris Agreement. And what we call the carbon intensification, or the carbon intensity of our economies, is reducing, which means we're getting more energy for less carbon. These are all good things.
Good to finally have a note of reassurance there. But Nick, I want to come back to the beginning of our conversation. We were talking about the record-breaking heat all across the Northern Hemisphere. Does it provide us a window into what Australia's summer will look like? Should we also be gearing up for dangerously high temperatures?
Look, we should be every summer, as the Climate and Energy Minister Chris Bowen said in a speech over the weekend. We should be gearing up for dangerously high temperatures every summer, particularly during El Niño years. And this will be an El Niño year, but that process has just begun. Because we've had several years of wetter than usual weather. we're likely to get fires, but they're unlikely this year, according to emergency chiefs. They're unlikely to be of the intensity that we saw in 2019 this year. If we do slip into drought, and there's a good chance that we could, we might be facing that next year. There will, or it's expected there'll be grass fires across much of New South Wales and Queensland this year. That's good news for people living in cities. It's horrific news for farmers and graziers and for the animals that live in that landscape.
And so does that reflect that we might be experiencing horrible bushfires then in the summer?
Probably not on the East Coast belt. That landscape is probably still wet enough to prevent the cataclysmic bushfires that we saw a couple of years ago. There will be fires, there will be every summer. But no, that might come if we have a more prolonged dry spell.
Thank you, Nick, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Hannah Mills-Turbot, with technical assistance from Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.